Hello and welcome everyone to today's Business Spectator webinar, the new outsourcing model, sponsored by Citrix GoToMeeting. I'm James Kirby, the Managing Editor of Business Spectator, and I'll be your moderator today. Now, look, while we're waiting just for the last few people to file in, I'll run through some quick housekeeping. First, to keep the note-taking to a minimum and the interaction to a maximum, we'll be providing you with a link tomorrow to the recording of this live session. And speaking of interaction, please take the opportunity throughout the webinar to write the panelists a question by using the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. As always, we'll do our best to answer all the questions you ask, but it may not be possible to respond to each and every one in the session. So apologies up front for that. Okay, well, let's get started. Our panelists today are Carus Palmer, our Business Spectator technology journalist and also the editor of Online Banking Review, and Warren Hill, an outsourcing specialist at the outsourcing firm Keen. Welcome to you both. Just before we hand over to Carus Palmer, who will present a short slide session to you this afternoon on the key aspects of outsourcing, I'm going to talk just across some of the themes I expect we will deal with today. And of course, we'll be guided largely by your questions, but we're going to look at some of the key trends, if you like, in outsourcing and what has been happening in recent times, in recent months, and indeed in recent years. We know some key features. We know that the marathon deals, the big 10-year deals that we used to see headlined across newspapers, often between banks and very large technology companies. It would seem that that era is coming to a close. What's not so apparent, and probably the reason why we've had such a terrific attendance today at our webinar, is what is going to replace that regime. We may well talk, I am sure, about the continuing rise in CRM, customer relationship management, but also the decline perhaps in some areas of the outsourcing of security-based technology. Some changing patterns maybe in offshore outsourcing, the rise of the Philippines in the offshore outsourcing world, and to that extent how India has become less important as a player there. We may come across some of the problems, some of the big problems that occasionally occur and are often reported in relation to outsourcing, and also the wins and of course the benefits, the key benefits of any firm of any size taking on this sort of activity. So first of all, let's have a look at the essentials, if you like, of outsourcing. Carus Palmer has put together a slide presentation, and I hope this will be useful to you in preparing your questions, which we will get round to once we are through this part of the program. Carus, hello and welcome to the webinar, and please, if you'd like to start.
Muted. Thank you, James, and thanks to everyone for joining us today. I firstly just wanted to move you through some of the basics of outsourcing. There's obviously going to be a mix of audience types and levels of sophistication amongst the people that have joined us today. So really to talk about outsourcing, defining it as what it is in terms of big business and also small business. So we'll go into more detail on that later, but firstly outsourcing is really just contracting out services to a third party in an effort to reduce costs generally, but there's a lot of other reasons that a company might outsource, and some of those include improving quality, shifting the focus back to the core business, accessing special skills or talent that you might not be able to get in-house, and in some cases reducing time to market. One of the myths I wanted to shoot down early on is that all outsourcing is offshoring. Offshoring and outsourcing are different. Offshoring is usually led by the cost saving. Offshoring involves outsourcing work to another market. And I guess thirdly, we touched on cloud computing in the presentation brief, and I wanted to ask the question, is cloud computing outsourcing? And the simple answer to that is yes, it's a form of outsourcing, but it's usually done on a pay-as-you-go or a software-as-a-service basis. And without getting into the technical ins and outs of cloud computing, I wanted to really talk to the link to outsourcing. And finally, in terms of just basic definitions, there's a lot of acronyms used in outsourcing, and that can obviously lead to confusion. So I just want to spell those out early on, and those are BPO, which is business process outsourcing, which is quite popular in amongst large Australian companies, KPO, which is knowledge process outsourcing, and ITO, which is information technology outsourcing. So to talk to my particular area of expertise, which is banking, and I guess banking being one of the leaders in outsourcing, I thought I'd have a look back and see what some of the leading bankers have said about outsourcing in the last sort of year and a half. And it's interesting that they've all taken quite a different approach. And if we look at Westpac, they have most recently signed one of the latest and I guess largest outsourcing deals with IBM. But the most interesting thing about the Westpac deal was that the deal was actually done in very different terms, and as James mentioned, it wasn't a big kind of, you are locked into this one vendor deal. It was a deal where instead of days gone by where a bank was tied to a particular vendor, in this case the deal they signed with IBM, whilst kind of relatively long term, I think at 5 years, it was actually open to flexibility in terms of other vendors being allowed to be brought in. So there was no exclusivity there, and Westpac were quite strong on the fact that their negotiations then led to them having that flexibility to look at other companies if they needed to bolt on other services that they may need to down the track and have that ability. So looking at CBA, which is the next bank that we wanted to look at of the big four, Michael Hart has been, I guess, the #1 fan of cloud computing in the Australian banking market and has spoken on the record on a number of occasions. And I think one of the interesting things is, again, he's talking about the cost of doing business of IT, and that banks don't want to be tied up with this infrastructure unless it's giving some value to them. So again, there's a link there with the importance of outsourcing, and a link there with saying, okay, if we're going to invest all this money in IT, what are we going to draw back down from it? What's going to be the benefit? And that requires a total rethink in terms of how big companies buy technology or outsource technology. So interestingly, moving on from there, another fan of IBM, and many of you would know Cameron Klein used to work for IBM. Again, they recently signed a deal, very recently signed a deal with IBM that was a long time in the making, and outside of the norm, again, it was a multi-year arrangement. Their transparency on what that deal entailed has not been as strong as what Westpac's has with their deal. But let's just say, it's there, it's happening, it's a major part of NAB's future roadmap. And quite differently to the other banks, is quite a big deal that locks them in as far as we can tell. And just finally, looking at the last of the big four banks, ANZ, the general overview with ANZ is that we now have a new CIO who's been there since last year, and Anne Weatherston has spoken publicly that she's not a big fan of outsourcing. So I guess we watch to see how ANZ will manage its IT in the future. So just looking at some of the key milestones in banking, really the things to point out are that banks are mostly not signing multi-year deals anymore. They are looking for more flexibility, and they're quite cautious about being tied in. The other thing we've seen as an ongoing trend is banks making promises about not offshoring customer service functions. So whilst there's a lot of outsourcing going on, and yes, there's been a lot of back office processing sent to other markets, including India, they have retained in-house their call centre functionality, their customer-facing services. And another interesting call-out recently is that banks will received a please explain letter from APRA, that's the banking regulator, on data that they've started outsourcing to the cloud. And banks are sort of very mindful of the fact that customer-related or sensitive data not be outsourced to an environment where it could be more easily breached. And it's a different session to argue about security of cloud, but obviously that's something to keep in mind. And just moving on to a very different area, I wanted to touch on for the companies out there that might not be big corporates, and for business owners out there, the importance of outsourcing for SMEs. And I think really services like freelancer.com and peopleperhour.com have become one of the most pervasive trends in outsourcing for SMEs, and they're now getting a massive share of traffic. And like any business, considering outsourcing, also it's critical to do an assessment of your needs and compare alternatives, because a lot of these services are popping up. The question is, do you jump on the bandwagon or do you look at what's happening? and then make a decision around, well, do you have a particular skill set that's missing, or do you have a particular service that could be best served with an outsourcing deal through one of these websites. And lastly, wanted to mention crowdsourcing, which is an alternative to sites like freelancer.com, where instead of one person bidding for the work, you get a whole group of companies bidding for the work. So Design Crowd's an example of where, if you're an SME, you can put out a bid, or or any sites company for that matter, but you can put out a bid for, say, a designer to design you a logo or a business card, and Design Crowd will decide what pricing point you're willing to pay. You tell them how much you're willing to pay, and basically designers bid around that price point. So it's a really interesting model that turns acquiring those sorts of services on its head, and again opens it up to a global marketplace, which obviously helps to reduce the cost. So that's really a summary of some of the things we're seeing in outsourcing, and I wanted at this point to open it up to questions, which will be led with James. So please, we hope we can get to all your questions and answer them promptly. Let's move on to that.
Unmuted.
Well, thank you very much, Karis, and thanks for that presentation. Terrific presentation, as usual, from you, and I think it touched off some of the key themes. We'll see what our listeners want to talk about and want to ask as we get through the session. As I mentioned earlier, I'm James Kirby from Business Spectator, and we're talking with Karis Palmer and Warren Hill from consulting firm Keen. I might address the first question to you, Warren. One of our listeners, Richard, has written in to ask whether security is better or worse now in outsourcing. I expect what he's alluding to is whether the security levels of outsourcing have actually become more stress tested, if you like, with changes to technology such as cloud. But you might pick that up for us.
Muted.
Yes, thanks, James. I think that security often is brought up as one of the major issues with outsourcing, and it's often confused around the point that Karis had made earlier with offshoring and security being a direct relative problem to each other. You'll find that the majority of data which is stolen from organizations is primarily done by employees within their existing organization who have access to the internal security systems and are able to breach those systems. Probably the most famous example rolling around at the moment is that RSA, who of course are the people that manage all security for all organizations and are the way that most people access their secure data, have been breached by their own employees, by one of their employees taking their main key and putting it out on the web for people to utilize. So I think you have to be very careful about how you define security, and it's really around making sure that you have the processes and the checks in place to ensure that the security that you put in place, regardless of where the people that are accessing it are based, is actually sufficient to manage the challenges that you will have from your regulators and from your client base.
Unmuted.
Oh, thank you, Warren. Actually, there is a second question, which we might just stay with you for the moment. It's from a reader, Frank, who asks about reverse auctions. He says, what is the future of reverse auctions in outsourcing? You might explain first, perhaps, what they are, and then what their future is. Thank you.
Muted.
So reverse auctions are similar to the crowdsourcing example which Karis gave earlier. So reverse auctions are where an organization will say, these are the services we'd like to have delivered, and against those services we believe there is a set level, so very much similar to your eBay environment, where each organization will bid to a point where the auction closes, and at the point that the auction closes, the bid that is the highest or meets the requirement is the bid that wins. What we are seeing in the outsourcing business, and it's a good question to ask, there's very clearly a move towards the smaller, what I would call the 5 to 50 outsourcing model, where if I need less than 50 people, I'm very comfortable with going to a very open market and saying this is something that is not going to fundamentally change the way I do business, but it's a service which I require the most effective, cost-effective model, and therefore I'll take it to an open marketplace and see what I can get for my money. You probably wouldn't do that with a critical business service, and certainly we haven't seen any of those reverse auctions associated with a critical business service. And it really depends on what you define as a commodity in some of the areas that are becoming commodities for purchase.
Unmuted.
Thank you, Warren. And pretty interesting, actually, some of the things you were alluding to there. We have a question from Emily. I might put this one to you, Karis. And it's interesting with some of the stories we see, some of the big corporate stories around at the moment. For instance, there's some industrial unrest at Qantas, for instance, around some issues of labour. But Emily's question is that she says, following the banks not wanting to be seen as outsourcing to offshore, is there a resurgence in domestic operations? Again, I presume what she's alluding to there is there some resurgence of activity in Australian outsourcing activity on the basis that there is a political backlash, even a consumer backlash perhaps, to outsourcing offshore? Karis.
That's
Muted.
an interesting question, Emily. Thanks for that. I think that, yeah, look, we've seen a fairly constant level of outsourcing among Australian banks. We've also seen an ongoing growth in offshoring. The question is how much transparency is around that. So I think whilst we're probably not, it wouldn't be fair to say there's been a resurgence in outsourcing closer to home. There's probably been a bit of a turn-off of offshoring a little bit, particularly for front-facing and customer-facing services, as I mentioned. So what you end up with is, you know, back office processing and, you know, things like mortgage processing for banks being sent offshore because it's a sort of very, you know, invisible process. The customer doesn't really see that. They do feel it as a customer. They know if it's slow, but certainly they don't see it and it's not as public. So I think they're both growing. The question is, you know, how, because it is so political, how banks and other big companies display it to customers, and therefore, you know, which sections of the organisation do they choose to outsource. And I think outsourcing will continue to grow, offshoring will continue to grow, but a case of, you know, the politics of which segments you outsource and offshore is where we've seen the real shift, and I don't think that will change. I think we'll continue to see a push away from, you know, for example, call centre front-facing staff being offshored, because whilst the telco sector uses it quite extensively, banks have said they won't use it because they know that customers typically hate it. So I think it really comes down to the transparency and the level of openness that organisations have around it.
Karis, just to add to that, I think one of the challenges that a lot of people don't realise in the Australian marketplace is that the work-from-home model, which exists in a number of countries and which helps to address the critical shortage of capable resource that we have in Australia. You know, in the US now, 40% of their call centre staff come from the work-from-home model and are very comfortable with having staff access their corporate systems, utilising their home networks. Now, our banks in particular are horrified by the concept that someone at home would have access to their internal customer relationship systems, and the telcos equally are not very far behind. Telstra's announcement last week that they're actually closing some of their more regional organisations because that's already too far away is probably a good example of that. So, you know, in a country that is short of labour, but where there is a surfeit of labour in the marketplace that is capable of performing outsourcing services in regional areas, I think that's something that really desperately needs to be looked at.
Unmuted.
Thank you, Warren. Actually, we might stay with you. An interesting question from Robert on a different subject and swinging back towards the area that is capturing so many people's attention, cloud computing. Maybe not the easiest question, but it's the question that I'm sure a lot of people in business are asking, having read so much about cloud computing. And he asks, what sort of cost savings are available in cloud computing? You might at least try to give some idea of what's the spectrum maybe of cost savings that's out there.
Muted.
I think I'll use a couple of examples of organizations that we've worked with and of both large and small. So probably the easiest one is the work that we did with a very small organisation here in Australia, which is the Australian Camps Association. They're an organisation that manages all of the camps across Australia. They have been a very strong advocate of the Microsoft platform. They have some pretty extreme remote areas that they need to get information to and from. If you think about where your children get sent to on school camps, it's probably a good indication of where those are. And in order to manage that organisation, they've got 10 people in their company. They needed 3 servers and all the associated software, which was probably running for them. It was running at about $3,000 a year, which you'd say is not a lot. But for them, that was a lot of money. They moved over to the Google Cloud platform, so they've moved to Google Docs. That cost them $50 per user, so that's an immediate saving of over 95%. Other organizations have gone down similar paths. Certainly the Salesforce.com phenomenon, we've moved over to that platform as well. Replacing the CRM on-site model is very strong, and a couple of the banks have used that for their Asian customer base, where because of the remoteness, the cost of the infrastructure to support that remote area requires a more open mindset, and therefore they've gone with a secure but in the cloud model. So I think that the cost savings are considerable as long as you can adapt your business model to work that way. I think that's the key factor.
Unmuted.
Thank you, Warren. We might stay on this. We might stay on this hard-nosed line of inquiry for the moment, because some of the questions are reflecting this, understandably so. And there is a question here from Kwok Tang, a very interesting question. He says, having heard, I imagine, our early conversation about how the time periods of the outsourcing contracts are getting shorter. The question is, how has pricing been impacted by this shorter reduction, if you like, in the tenure of these contracts? Warren, if you'd like to take that on board.
Muted.
Yeah, it's interesting. We saw this trend probably 3 to 4 years ago, and where we saw organizations that have outsourced their existing long-term contracts, so 4 or 5 or 10 years, they've outsourced a particular key platform within their organization, and 10 years later, as the contract is coming to an end, they found that the only people, and there are a couple of banks in Australia that have this challenge, as well as some other organizations, is that the only people that actually know now any of the intellectual property of how those systems work are the outsourced business that they've outsourced it to. So they've had no improvement in the technology that they're using. They've had virtually no improvement in the ability to be able to make change to that technology, but they have managed to have a longevity with their outsourced provider. What we're seeing on the pricing side is a view of we'd like to get to cost-neutral legacy transformation. So we'll give you a 5-year deal, and at the end of the 5-year deal, we want to see that the legacy platform we currently have has been replaced by something that will be cheaper to maintain, that will give us access to skills in the marketplace, and that will eventually allow us to replace the technology we have. And we want you to price that in, and in some cases, in certain organizations, we want you to price in the managing that through with the external vendor. So you may have to go to one of those software vendors as the outsourcer and take on the responsibility of delivering a new platform to your customer.
Unmuted.
Thank you, Warren. Cost neutral. It's a beautiful thought. I expect it's something well worth striving after. We have a question from Andrew, and it's a banking-related question, Karis. He asks in relation to the Westpac's IBM outsource contract. He says, what sort of improvements or savings might Westpac expect from its IBM deal?
Muted.
Well, that's a tough one, isn't it, Warren? I think essentially, the sorts of deals are done, as Warren alluded to, and of course Westpac had IBM as a partner previously. So sometimes it's better the devil you know and not just about cost saving. And I'd have to say, you know, the question always comes with outsourcing, well, you know, are you only doing it for cost? And you know, I would question whether Westpac would be seeing significant cost savings out of this deal, although I'm not privy to the full details of the deal. The question comes down to stability, longevity of partner, inside information, skills, a lot of those other issues, and those are the sorts of benefits that I suspect that they were looking for as part of this deal. Although having said that, they probably went into it with a lot greater negotiating power than they've ever had, and that would of course allowed them to help push down, you know, not being an insider with Westpac, that would be what I'd pretty much sort of surmise in terms of where that deal went.
Unmuted.
Thank you, Karis. Well, yes, I'm sure only a Westpac insider could truly give us an answer there, and probably couldn't give us an answer just yet. But there is some very interesting questions coming up on the screen on all aspects of this. It's obviously really capturing people's imagination. But I just want to come back to Warren, if I can. Stuart has asked an interesting question. He says, yes, there are of course cost savings here, but is there any measurable example of service improvement? So obviously it's not all about cost, and I don't know how measurable such a thing is, KPIs, etc. But if it was possible, Warren, if you had some example in mind, you might answer that question. Thanks.
Muted.
Thanks, James. I think that, so the short answer is yes, absolutely, there have been proven service productivity values, and you can model a lot of those. There's a number of technologies that allow you to do that, as well as the people to do that. The more probably interesting play is as platform as a service is evolving, and so this is where you have an existing platform that you outsource the technology and you outsource the productivity that sits on top of it. So you may, for example, have an HR system and you take the HR people and outsource them together, and therefore as part of the deal that you go to your outsourcer with, you ask them to improve the productivity by 30–40%. And what we find often is that the client's definition of how they're going to improve the 30–40% is related to the fact that they actually don't know the productivity of what they have today. And so there's a real challenge in the marketplace to identify how the process works today and then measure that and then align that to what the productivity improvement would be. And so getting those KPIs right and making sure that you understand what the existing productivity is probably more important than actually taking it out, outsourcing it to another vendor.
Unmuted.
Thank you, Warren. An issue that I'm sure is, this is a big picture issue, if you like, but it's a good question. It's from John, and it's deductive, I suppose. Maybe, Karis, you might begin the answer to this. He's asking if there is an acceleration, basically, of insourcing. Is there a measurable swing back towards insourcing across industry? It might certainly be worth referring to some examples here, or at least addressing it where we can see it happening. But I might begin with you, Karis. Thanks.
Muted.
Thanks, James. I'm sure Warren probably has some good examples. I think that, you know, again, as I alluded to earlier, outsourcing and offshoring seem to be pretty much here to stay, and the growth of those, I think, will continue. In terms of a backlash, I think, you know, leading back to insourcing, I think it's come back to some critical, you know, customer-facing issues again. I think perhaps in telco we may see that. Another thing we're seeing is instead of outsourcing, you know, call center questions, I guess an example I would bring up of insourcing would be a case where an organisation might use a better customer service platform around self-service. So instead of relying on human beings, whether they be in Australia or the Philippines, to answer questions, to actually improve the customer experience so that you can preempt some of those questions and answer those questions, and that involves, you know, the knowledge base inside of a company that may not be held in an outsourced group getting better at what it does and getting better at solving problems without having to go to a human being where they sit. And because human beings essentially are expensive to solve problems, being able to solve those problems by using the knowledge base that you have, and that's using the data that you have and using platforms, whether it be voice recognition to, and to speed a customer through rather than having a person, which, again is controversial in itself, or actually just having a better service experience in the IVR when that answers an automated response, or having a better suite of services on your website, or more proactive servicing that you can do in-house through, as I said, using your data and your knowledge that you already have.
Unmuted. Muted.
Technologist answer is always to throw more technology at the problem. So very well put, Karis, but perhaps not the right approach. I think that we've seen some interesting trends, and not necessarily towards insourcing in particular, but what we have seen is organisations that have decided again around what is critical to my business, and I've outsourced too much, and I need to bring some of those critical business parts back into the organisation. And we have one client that's recently gone through a merger and acquisition process, and as a result of that, they've brought most of their shared service back to Australia. Although the majority of their business is actually conducted outside of Australia. The reason for that is that thanks to the wonders of the Australian dollar and the way that they've got their organisation structured, they've been able to bring a lot of that critical business path back into the business and then get it under control, because they've realised with their global expansion that they actually don't have the control that they need in order to continue the expansion at the rate that it's happening. And so they'll bring it back in-house, they'll tidy it up, and then they'll take it back out again.
Unmuted.
Yeah, thank you, Warren. As you say, it's not necessarily a one-way street. It's not necessarily going in a straight line, and it's an evolving business practice, which doesn't necessarily begin or end. It could begin, be reformulated and start again. But just coming to one part of your answer to that question, I have a question from Mina, and she's talking about issues critical to her business, and what she's worried about is IP. And she asks, how can we minimize the loss of IP in these situations, Warren?
Muted.
Really good question, and it's interesting. I used to work for one of the very large Indian outsourcers, and every day the CEO of a company would say our entire IP walks out of the building and we let it go and hope it comes back the next day. And I know that one of the banks is struggling with this particular problem at the moment, where they've outsourced part of their business and they're not managing to hold on to that. I think there are a couple of things that you really have to look at. One is the knowledge management platform that you put in place. So whether that's a people-driven platform or technology is irrelevant. You need to make sure that your knowledge management is solid, and that the areas that are your IP are very carefully supported and managed, and that you lock that area down. I think a lot of people don't realise what their IP is until it's walked out the door and someone else has used it, and they believe what their IP is. And in particular, in application development and in technology support, there are a lot of areas where there's a very fine line between the technology that you've bought from a vendor and what you've done with that technology in order to make it work within your environment may not necessarily mean that you still own your IP. And so ensuring that you get those IP clauses in your contracts is something that a lot of people overlook when they're implementing a new technology.
Unmuted.
Thank you, Warren. A question from Madeline, which is an interesting question, and I like the way it's framed, though I have a sense that the answer will not be so easy to put together. But she asked, which country is best for outsourcing? But it's probably an answer that's changing all the time. Karis, would you like to address that and see, maybe even from the bank's point of view, in your experience, which country has been the most popular one?
Muted.
Certainly a moving feast, James, and every year we see the top 10 lists of countries to outsource to, and it is actually moving that quickly. And now to a point where we have enough choice available to us. China is now a viable alternative for some things. India is well established, the Philippines is quite well established. Those countries, you know, are able to be split now along the types of things that you're wanting to outsource. So for voice, for example, a lot of people like to outsource to the Philippines because, you know, the accent isn't as, I guess, offensive to some people as the Indian accent is, which unfortunately does instantly turn some people off. And, you know, again, business process outsourcing, you know, there's a few markets, as I said, including India, where, you know, the accuracy, you know, is important. It's about data processing, so, you know, it's not about voice. And again, probably India is the favourite one there. And I think, you know, Warren's probably got something he can add to that, but I think, you know, the top three are there now. That will change over time, no doubt.
Unmuted. Muted.
A couple of things to add to Karis's point. I'd suggest that any country that produces in excess of 20 million undergraduates a year that are well educated and that can speak good English are probably good candidates. So we're certainly seeing a significant impact and influence across the Asia-Pac region in the countries such as Vietnam, Thailand, Malaysia, where they're pushing very hard to ensure that that people educated through the university system are educated in English rather than being educated and then taught English. China is a good example. They're currently something like 45 million students learning English as part of their general schooling prior to getting to university, and then when they get to university they are taught only in English. So if they can't speak English by the time they get there, they're not going to get through university. The second thing that I would add, and it was a really interesting conversation we had with one of the major outsourcing consulting vendors, which is TPI, is that the United States is probably emerging as the fastest growing outsourcing country. So the US dollar and the relative cost to support out of the US is dropping at such a rapid rate that the US is becoming a very viable alternative. And if you have a look at the investments that most of the major Indian vendors are making into regional United States at this point in time, and setting up data centers and call centers across the US and staffing it with local staff in the US, and then offering those services, ironically, to some of the Indian banks and to some of the other areas because it's cheaper.
Unmuted.
That's fascinating, Warren. I just must ask you one short question about that. And if it's currency-based, it's currency-based acceleration of US-based outsourcing services, do you think it would last?
Muted.
Sorry. Yeah, I think it will, and the reason I think it will is because there is a huge pool of educated resource sitting in the United States that has been very underutilized, and organizations in the US have been very focused on how do we get our big city costs out of the big city, and when India was sitting at a very comfortable 30 to 35% cost, it was a very attractive model. Rising costs in India, India's, I don't know if anybody knows, but India's salary costs are rising at about 15 to 20% year on year. Their CPI is in the 30s, so they will probably reach parity with the US within the next 5 to 10 years, and therefore it will make a huge difference.
Unmuted.
That's absolutely fascinating, and I suppose part of the answer too might be the fact that if you've got 10% unemployment and it won't come down, it's amazing how things will change, and people will be creative and innovative around that, and you get some almost counterintuitive trends. Just back to brass tacks, if you like, with Sarah, who has a question which is a very rational question indeed. Just coming back to you, Warren, on something you said earlier. This is the problem, of course, questions follow answers. And she asks about businesses outsourcing, then taking it back and cleaning it up and putting it out again. Two questions. One, is it cost effective to do that? And perhaps pertinently, is it common to do that?
Muted.
So to answer the first part of the question, which is the key one, probably 70% of organizations that outsource do it badly the first time, and most of them do it badly because they actually don't have their processes well enough defined in order to do that. And so they outsource a problem because it's a problem, and they think that it's too expensive to fix. They give it to someone else, they let someone else manage it, which brings the cost down, but it doesn't actually fix the problem. And so then they have to bring it back in-house in order to get it under control and get it fixed. And once it is fixed, they can then take it and get a much better cost value for that, because they can actually now define, and to that productivity question we had earlier, they can actually define what their costs should be as opposed to what their costs were.
Unmuted.
Thank you, Warren. One final question, which we have here from Rob, and he asks, what is the outstanding change in outsourcing in recent years? It's an interesting question, and I'd just like to put it to both of you. Maybe Karis, you might first reflecting on financial services. What is the outstanding change in outsourcing in recent years? And Warren, if you can, perhaps you might answer it in the frame of all business and SMEs as well, for them to answer that. Karis.
Muted.
I think it comes down to power and where the power sits. I think, offshoring's not going away. It is here to stay, but the power play that happens between a bank and the IT providers has really shifted. I think that is the first critical point to make. And secondly, the power play between a bank and its customers has shifted to the point where, again, a bank has to be careful about what it outsources more so than it had to be in the past.
I think the most interesting trend that's emerged over the last 12 months has been the effect that social media has. So somewhat to Karis's point, but social media has made a significant change in the way that people perceive the organizations that they work with, and therefore not just technology is outsourced, but many parts of an organization is outsourced, and when one of those parts falls over, it is incredible how quickly the information gets out regarding what the problem has been and how it's been caused, whether it's insourced or outsourced. And certainly the impact of social media is having a significant effect.
Unmuted.
Thank you, Warren. Very interesting. Yes, the social media dimension didn't come up in our questions, but of course it comes up in all aspects of business, and perhaps in outsourcing too. There was the general disclosure, if you like, or transparency of corporations and businesses is changing, and part of that is social media. And to that extent, where once a corporate might simply announce a very large outsourcing deal, it now has to be much more sensitive and diplomatic in how they do that, and social media obviously reveals some of the flows in previous processes. Well, thank you very much for everyone today for our seminar. I would like to thank now panelist Karis Palmer of Business Spectator and Online Banking Review, and Warren Hill of Keene, and our sponsor Citrix GoToMeeting. And thanks to you very much for attending and your involvement in today's event. We do appreciate it. Please take the opportunity to provide us with direct feedback about today and send us some topics you might like to see covered in the future. You will be sent a link to our recording tomorrow. We hope to see you again at another of these interactive sessions. From James Kirby, editor of Business Spectator, thank you and goodbye.